Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the final day of the Illinois 60 by 25 Network Annual Conference. This year's theme is Forward Together, Navigating Uncertainty and Advancing to 60% by 2025. We've had a wonderful past few days with all of you going through a number of just really exciting plenary sessions and breakout sessions. We've had people from all over Illinois, across the country, attending all of our different sessions and presenting and sharing some really incredible practices about that include how we can really grapple with the current moment and move into our new normal, ever evolving new normal as we are experiencing in our virtual format this year for the first time ever. So thank you all for being here. Thank you for being a part of the conference. My name is Emily Ruska. I'm Director of State Policy and Strategy at Education Systems Center at Northern Illinois University. We are one of the 3 network organizations that is putting on this conference alongside Advance Illinois and the Illinois Student Assistance Commission. And I'm here to offer a warm welcome and to introduce our speakers this morning. This morning, we're going to be hearing from Michael Collins from JFF, who's the Vice President of Programs there, and Adrian Esquivel from the Chicagoland Workforce Funder Alliance, where he's the Deputy Director. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Michael, who's going to give us an overview of the national context and some really valuable research on the future of work and what we are doing as a system, what we can do as a system to ensure that we are driving towards equitable outcomes in the future in work and employment. And then after Michael shares his work with us, we're going to hear from Adrian, who will talk a little bit about the Chicagoland context as well. And then we'll have a fireside chat without the fire, just to bring it all together. So without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to Michael. Thanks.
Thank you so much. It's really great to be with you today and get to share, kind of a conversation. So I'm going to make a quick adjustment here and share my screen. All right, so there we go. So it's, again, great to be with you. And again, Michael Collins, Jobs for the Future. I want to tell you a little bit about what we do to give you some context for kind of what I'd like to talk about today. And so JFF, we are a national nonprofit organization. We work to transform our nation's education and workforce development systems to create economic opportunity for all. We do design work, we do scaling work, we do influence work, and we also invest. So really quickly, our design work is really about bringing evidence-based models to life. We design new models and we really try to push on kind of innovation of both our education and workforce development systems. We also try to scale what works in our scaling practice. We do a lot of work through networks across the country. I believe we're working in just about every state. Our influence work is our policy work. We work at the state and systems level, and we also work at the federal level in policy advocacy and policy reform. And finally, we have an arm of the organization that is an investment arm, and we invest in mission-aligned startup companies, technology companies, social entrepreneurs. We really try to identify innovation and new economy models that can help with the transformation of education and workforce development. We have a 501c3 arm of JFF. It's called JFF Labs, and JFF Labs is really trying to push on innovation because we think that we need both kind of in-system, kind of the traditional education, post-secondary and workforce approach, and we need to understand how we harness technology on behalf of low-income people and people who are experiencing poverty. So that's some background. So my personal work at JFF historically has been on the post-secondary side. I have worked across the country over the last 15 years. I joined JFF in 2004, and I have worked on state and system level policy around institutional transformation. So all of that work was really to try to redesign kind of policies and practices to get more low-income people and people of color into and through community college programming, onto transfer, into workforce development programs, into jobs. And so that's kind of been my work. So I wanted to just kind of give that framing. And here's, I'll tell you, I'm hoping that you will see why I've given you that framing. So I love conversations like this, and I wish that we could be together, because I think, it gives me so much energy, and I hope it gives you energy when we're connecting with each other, right? Like, we're innovating, we're trying to build systems, programs, practice, policy, networks, to help people who are struggling in our economy. And our work is so important, and we give each other energy. So on one level, I'm happy to be on the screen, but I wish I was with you, and I want to just thank you for everything that you're doing. So as we kind of do this work, those of us who have done this work, for decades, we're experiencing this moment in different ways. And I just want to share kind of this talk is really kind of my personal, because the personal is professional for me as a Black man doing this work. I'll be upfront with that. The professional is personal and vice versa. And so as I've thought about what we are experiencing in this moment right now, when I look at the outcomes for people of color and for Black people specifically, it made me rethink everything that I've done in my career. I have worked really hard to really create opportunity through the post-secondary, through college. And so I've come to understand that what I've believed is a strategy for economic advancement. In many ways, the college piece, there are some stories that I've told myself about it that I'm not so sure are true. And I don't know what story you tell yourself about what college does, but let's just have this conversation. So the traditional story about kind of college in this country, right? Like, it is how we make it. It's how, low-income people are able to change their circumstances and fully participate in our democracy, right? It's what creates economic opportunity, and what creates economic mobility. And that's why I dedicated my life and my career to creating college for opportunity. Unfortunately, I've come to the conclusion that the college mobility narrative, that you go to college, you graduate, and you kind of go into the labor market, and you successfully kind of advance progressively over a career. It's when I look at the data, it's not true. In fact, it's a myth. It does not work like that. And it's hard to grapple with, because we put so much on kind of college as the strategy for economic mobility. So bear with me, because I know that this, it kind of rattles us, right? Because it's the lever that we've been pushing and using, many of us. So here's why I believe it's a myth, right? So it is true in some cases, like myths, right? Like, there's some elements of truth. So it's true for, the most wealthy in this country, right? So in some ways, it's not necessarily upward mobility for them. It's like lateral, right? You're born in the top fifth, you go to college, and you end up in the top fifth, right? Maybe you even end up in the upper tails of that, right? Like if you're at some of our nation's most selective schools. So it is true that the elite colleges in this country do produce kind of bottom to top mobility. And what I mean by that is, if you go to those colleges, if you're low income, in the bottom fifth of income, and you go to one of our nation's most selective institutions, it's true. You end up in the top fifth of income, and that's really powerful. The challenge is that only less than 4% of people from the bottom fifth of income actually attend those institutions. So like, when we say that college is this kind of accelerator and this elevator to upward mobility and economic opportunity, I think that it's partially true, and it really it depends, right? It's certainly not true, for Black people and people of color, right? So Black people who go to college and actually graduate are actually more likely to stay low income, and there's evidence that they are more likely to be unemployed and underemployed and earn less across all degrees, essentially, right? So like, this notion that college, kind of is a ticket, to economic mobility, we need to interrogate it, and we really need to rethink it. We need to modernize it, right? And so that's what I want to kind of briefly talk about. So why do we believe this? Why do we believe that college is kind of the ticket to upward mobility? as I thought about this, I thought, like, where does this come from? And so I really, when I look at, kind of our history, there's some major policies that really feed this idea. Many of us talk about, and hear about the impact of the GI Bill. It was this incredible legislation that created economic opportunity for, and essentially created the middle class, right? Millions of veterans were able to, kind of go to college. There were elements of that legislation that created opportunity for people to even start businesses. There was mortgage supports. It was just an incredible driver, right? And so many of the middle class at that time were able to, it was created in some ways because they were able to go to college. Fewer people know about the Truman Commission, but like I do a lot of work, in community colleges, and Truman Commission was this, it wasn't legislation, but it was this kind of really important kind of policy statement that really said, hey, this country can benefit from more community colleges. There needs to be community colleges across the country. We need to create access for people who are not able to go to a four-year institution. And these colleges need to be affordable. They need to be accessible. They need to be able to allow people to enter into kind of professions in their local areas. And while there was no policy, it was a very important, I think, start for community colleges. I mean, in fact, the Truman Commission did create community colleges and opened up access for people who had not had college. So again, reasonably, you could think a GI Bill, Truman Commission, yes, this fuels kind of like, hey, why we might think that there is this elevator to upward mobility through college. And then, of course, the Higher Education Act of 1965 that the Pell Grants grew out of. We have this understanding that that not only is college important, but like we provide financial aid for people to to go to college and to be successful. And again, it was like our commitment, right, that we believe as a body politic that college is the key, and so we're going to fund it. We're going to give people financial aid to go, and so all of those things fuel kind of why we believe that college. So community colleges also, I think, in many ways, kind of tout themselves to be kind of engines of economic mobility. And when you look at philanthropy over the last kind of decade and a half, you see successive completion initiatives. I happen to have worked in all of these different initiatives on policy, and in each of these initiatives, the premise of these different initiatives, and many of them were focused on low-income people, people of color having access, to community colleges because of their importance to upward mobility, that kind of narrative that I told you. So these successive initiatives, hundreds of millions of dollars invested in kind of this notion that college was is the key to upward mobility. But there's some things that have been missing, right, from this narrative, even though that's compelling and it fuels maybe why we believe the narrative. When you look a little bit closer, there's some gaps. So when you look at the GI Bill, it's true that it helped to create the middle class, but people of color really didn't benefit in the same ways, right? So, Black veterans were not, it's not that they weren't eligible, but they weren't able to leverage it, right? So Southern politicians prevented, it was not administered federally, it was administered locally. And so Southern politicians were able to prevent, Black veterans from fully benefiting from it. Black veterans also were kind of relegated to historically Black colleges. And at the time, those colleges didn't have the capacity to serve them. And so it was not a huge driver in the same way, that it was for white veterans. The Truman Commission, it's very true that it's extended access to community colleges and enrollment, and I'll show in a minute, enrollment certainly went up in those colleges, and it did create opportunity, but completion in some ways, there were challenges with people completing what they started. And so the presumption of kind of having community colleges everywhere was that or the assumption was that people would actually complete their programs, right? And that is not what has happened. So again, it kind of a crack in the mobility narrative. And then finally, the Higher Education Act and the Pell Grants, not to look a gift horse in the mouth, it's generous financial aid, but it really doesn't cover the cost of college. When you think about low income people, and it's especially kind of people who are, for all intents and purposes, kind of working adults, right? Like they may have family responsibilities, many things that kind of require them to essentially have to support themselves to go to college. So that the dollars today, really only support 30% of what it used to, right? It used to be cover 3/4 of college. Today, it's a much smaller percentage. And so all of these are cracks in the narrative. So I wanted to just kind of talk a little bit about what specifically this means for people with my background, so Black Americans that were in the press these days, unfortunately, for something I'd rather not be in the press for, right? So we are, as a country, awakened to what people are, surprisingly coming to understand is, structural racism, systemic racism, something that, many of us have known about for a long time. But this is what it looks like for us. So in starting with regard to college as a strategy for economic mobility, number one, Black Americans are, we're less likely to climb the income ladder. Okay, so if you are Black and born in the bottom fifth of income, by the time you're 40 years old, half of us, right, are still stuck at the bottom. And when you look at that for whites, so only 23% of them are stuck at the bottom. So college doesn't appreciably, right, like change our it doesn't accelerate our mobility at the same rates. Also, I mentioned earlier about the enrollment. So yes, enrollment in community colleges and college in general is up for Black Americans. That's very positive, right? You see some big jumps here over kind of the period of time here over 10 years here, huge jumps. But graduation, has stayed pretty flat, right? So we still have the challenge of completion. And then when you look at kind of earnings, there are major gaps in earnings across all levels, whether it be high school, college completion, or completion of associate's degree, and that goes on, right? So again, this whole notion, right, that college is, kind of the traditional kind of college as mobility comes into question. So there's a lot of discussion and debate now around, well, it's not just college, their skills are important, and sub-baccalaureate's really important, and I think it's important too, but when you look at that data, and this data is from the Center for Education and Workforce at Georgetown, when you look at this data, this is data on earnings power of sub-baccalaureate credentials. And so when you look at kind of this large bar here that's kind of to the right, the higher wage sub-baccalaureate degrees and credentials are in the engineering technologies, right? Like in the STEM and quantitatively oriented programs. But when you look at what kind of Black people and people of color are actually studying, when you look at the programs of study that they're in, they are more likely to be to the left here, right? Like in some of these programs of study here, which clearly you can see, are low wage. So, that's not the sub-baccalaureate and skills route is not necessarily, a panacea either. So I know that this is challenging, but this is the world we live in, right? This is not my data, this is the data, right? So there's also, even when we complete credentials and degrees, there's structural discrimination in the labor market, right? So we have the callback studies. If you have a Black sounding name, less likely to get a callback. And again, I mentioned the wage discrimination. So COVID hasn't helped, but COVID also, the employment before COVID, people don't realize that the unemployment spike, it's not a surprise, right, for Black Americans. Since the 70s, the Black unemployment rate has been double the white unemployment rate, right? So like, and that's even with the enrollment. I mentioned the enrollment increases in college. So more, people have gone to college, but it hasn't really helped with regard to, kind of employment and mobility. So I'm going to show one more slide, and then I'm going to, I know we've gone down. I'm going to hopefully take us up. So really quickly, unfortunately, people who make it to the middle class, Black families who make it to the middle class are actually likely to see their children actually downwardly mobile. So this is one of the stats that hurts me the most. I have a 10-year-old son, and all the data suggests that, rather than kind of stay where he is, right, where he was born, right? Like if you think about Black people who are born in that middle kind of quintile, it's 70% chance that they will fall into the bottom two. So if they're born here with the cursor there, it's 7 out of 10 will fall into these below, right? So we've got some challenges. So solutions. So there are no easy answers, but I really believe that there are some things that we can do. So we know that structural racism is an issue. We know that there's systemic inequality. But one of the levers that we have is to make better connections to work, right? So much of what's happening in post-secondary education is supply side, right? So we're getting people into college, but we're not paying enough attention to what they're studying. We're not paying attention to their demographic and the impact that will have or may have on their successful transition into work, right? We want to be race neutral. We want to deal with that, even though the data tells us, right, like it's a salient factor. So what would it look like if we began to think about how do we make more direct, connections to work? How do we help people of color, low-income people build kind of knowledge that they need to select programs of study that lead to credentials that pay family supporting wages and that can put them on a trajectory of upward economic mobility? And how do we develop relationships, right? Social capital is really important. My colleague, Nancy Hoffman, and I wrote a book. It's called Teaching Students About the World of Work. And we make the argument that we have to do a better job of helping people who don't have much schema for college and for the labor market to understand the implications of what they study, who they know, and how what they've studied and who they know can help them successfully transition in the labor market. This is about social capital. It's really important, and it's a missing piece that I think that we need to leverage for low-income people and people of color. Coming in, not at the end, not waiting to graduation, but at the front end of the student experience. How are we connecting them to information around kind of programs of study that lead to good jobs in their region that have opportunities for advancement, and how are we connecting them to people who are employers themselves or connected to employers, work-based learning, internships, those types of opportunities I think are really important. I'm not going to dwell here because we know that the combination between kind of COVID, the new awareness on structural racism certainly jars, right? Like the college mobility notion, we have to rethink it. And I hope that, I've made that case. So, if we are rethinking it and we're modernizing it, if we can center race, right? Like we have tried to avoid race, but can we center race and factor in the reality that race matters? I put this data up here. It's really painful, but if you're a Black family, no matter what income level, the outcome for your sons is not as promising as kind of peers, right? So Raj Chetty and his colleagues at Opportunity Insights used a vast data set using administrative data, and they have found when they examine intergenerational mobility that Black Americans, you can have the same level of education, same level of income, same level of assets, and your children will make less, your sons will make less than their white peers, even if everything else is like identical, even if they live on the same street. Like that's the data. And 99% of the census tracts in this country, Black boys will earn less, right? And so that kind of, again, it signals our challenge. How do we disrupt that? I think that we can disrupt it by, of course, addressing some of the systemic barriers, but also I think that we have to really acknowledge that programs of study matter. Like let's make sure that we are aligning people to programs that matter. Social capital matters. And let's not pretend that race doesn't impact successful transitions to the labor market. Let's build those relationships. Let's help people understand what needs to happen, how they need to navigate that. Really kind of closing out here, I think that when I think about a call to action and things that we can work on together, these are some of the things that I think that are really important. I think that later on in the discussion, we'll be able to talk about some of these, and because I'm out of time here, but I want to, if nothing else, to kind of shake us and jar us a little bit to really interrogate kind of college as kind of a categorical accelerator to mobility. It can be, if we take care of some of the things that I've mentioned here, and I think that if we do that, that can be really kind of a strategy that can help us begin to modernize the mobility narrative. And with that, I will stop and turn it back over to you, Emily. Thank you so much.
Michael, thank you so much for that provocative and really informative presentation. I'm really looking forward to putting it in conversation with what Adrian will be sharing shortly about the local context in Chicagoland and how some of these issues come up locally. And I think, just based on the discussion in the chat, you've already given folks a lot to chew on, and I'm really looking forward to continuing to dig in. So without further ado, Adrian, the stage is yours.
Cool. Thanks, Emily. Thanks, Michael. I really enjoyed hearing all that. I mean, enjoy as much as you can enjoy hearing that, but I really feel like it's going to feed well into talking a little bit about what is happening in Chicagoland right now. So, hi everyone. Thanks for having me here today. Good morning. My name is Adrian Esquivel. I'm the Deputy Director with the Chicagoland Workforce Funder Alliance. We are a funder collaborative housed at the Chicago Community Trust, the region's community foundation. So I'm here today to talk a little bit about a spotlight on Chicagoland, and I think a lot of what Michael said is really relevant to what we are seeing and experiencing and trying to work on here in the area. So I think some of this is going to be really complementary, or a lot of it will be really complementary to what Michael was talking about. So I'm going to talk about three things, or three kind of streams of work that the Funder Alliance and our partners are working on, and trying to bring them together and through this kind of way of what is the latest data showing us. How can we change mindsets and systems within the region? And then also, what's one way employers are changing to close equity gaps? And then asking the question, is it enough? And spoiler alert, probably not, but that's why we got to keep moving on as well too. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is a report that just came out for 5 different regions, and it's part of the series called the Advancing Workforce Equity Report. So the Funder Alliance, where I work, is a part of a national network of kind of other funder alliances called the National Fund for Workforce Solutions. And along with PolicyLink, Burning Glass Technologies worked on a project around advancing workforce equity. So 5 reports were created for 5 areas: Chicago, Dallas, Boston, Seattle, and the Bay Area. And in these reports, they were guided by local, what we call equity work groups. So Emily was on ours as well as people from private industry and education, workforce development, and others as well, policymakers. And a report was generated and created, which we'll either drop in the chat, or I'll send a link, or a link will probably be sent at some point as well. You can read the full report, but essentially one of the big takeaways is, as the workforce grows more diverse, racial inequities threaten the region's economic prosperity. So again, everything in this report is, for those of us who've been working on the ground, may not seem especially revelatory, but it's important and impactful to see the actual data. So our group when we came together to then determine what would be studied or what would be researched, came up with a definition of workforce equity that we would use as our working definition for that as well. So you can see it on the screen right there. I'll let you read it for a moment. But I think the last line is I find to be especially important to note, which is that our strategies that we want to have are systemic so that equity is permanent. We want to think about using programs and initiatives in service of systemic change in order to make equity permanent, because yeah, we'll get into a little more of that. So the next few slides have some data that shows some information. I'm not really going to talk a whole lot about it, but I find it kind of interesting to look at, to frame where we are in the region. But there are more statistics, more data, more information in the report that I would encourage you to look at as well. So what this shows is that nearly half of Chicago's current workforce and almost 60% of the emerging workforce are people of color. So emerging workforce is defined as people under the age of 25, and the current workforce includes the employed population between the ages of 25 and 64. So again, you can see the information somewhat disaggregated right there. And then they took a little bit further to see that the region's GDP would be more than $136 billion larger if racial gaps in income were eliminated. So the methodology is in the report, but I believe what it is indicating is that if Black and Latinx workers were paid at the rate of white workers, this is the equity dividend that would be there as well. And then to the point that Michael was making earlier, we had these conversations of, as we increase education, as we increase training, that Black and Latinx workers are still disproportionately underrepresented in much of the workforce as well. So we see here across racial and ethnic activity groups, joblessness declines steadily as educational attainment increases, but racial inequities remain. So that's what that is. And again, I know there's a lot of on there, but I'm moving through it just to show that Black and Latinx workers earn substantially less than their white counterparts at every level of educational attainment. So again, to the point that Michael was making as well, that we see here in the Chicagoland region, it mirrors exactly what Michael was saying, that as we train, as we educate individuals, Black and Latinx workers will substantially earn less than their white counterparts. So within our work group, as we were trying to develop strategies or guideposts for future work, we were trying to realize and think about, we can't keep going along how we've been going along before, because we're seeing the same thing. Or if we try to continue to use a lot of the strategies that traditional workforce development does, which is increasing skills or identifying higher paying jobs and then training people to those, we're still going to have the racial disparities as well. And then also the report's going to highlights some of the things that are social determinants of work. So we think about childcare access, mobility and transportation, and getting from one place to the other, that also disproportionately harms Black and Latinx workers. So this slide right here shows that childcare places a higher financial burden on Black and Latinx households as well. So this report is showing a lot of data for the Chicagoland region that mirrors what people have been talking about nationally, as well as what people have been talking about at community levels as well. So things that people are experiencing and feeling on a day-to-day basis. We'd probably look at this report and not see anything new, but it's helpful to see what the data in the report shows. So our working group then tried to figure out what are some guideposts or strategies for implementation and what we would actually do. So this process started 14 months ago, prior to the COVID pandemic, and also prior to the increased publicity around systemic racism that happened over the summer. So as opposed to creating specific strategies that we would then try and implement within the region, we tried to influence and work towards influencing existing tables that were arising from the pandemic and the increased publicity around systemic racism. So in the Chicagoland area, there was a COVID-19 Rapid Response Fund that was created. There was the mayor's office put together an equity task force or a rapid recovery task force that came out with some recommendations. Private philanthropy has come together to create the Together We Rise Fund, which is focused on an equitable recovery. So as opposed to creating another report or another set of strategies, our group put together these guideposts for implementation that we feel like are important to increase equity. So one is elevate and amplify worker voice and worker power. As I stated before, traditional workforce development centers employers, centers capital. We want to make sure that we're centering people and workers as much as we want to center them and their experiences as well as a necessary need within workforce development. We will still use the bread and butter sector-based workforce development strategies, but we need to make sure that they're building pathways into good jobs for workers of color. And I'll talk a little bit later in the presentation about a specific example of where that's happening. We want to improve job quality and economic security for workers of color. and then also develop strategies to close racial gaps in the social determinants of work. So that's the issue I was talking about with childcare, transportation, and others as well. Things that we all know are barriers, but we want to raise the conversation to say that it's not enough to say, well, that's not really workforce development, or oh, I don't really want to fund that because that's a different problem. But we need to start thinking about these social determinants of work as being integral for trying to close equity gaps as well. And then leverage the report to inform and influence existing coalitions and communities. So this is the first third of the presentation about kind of what is the data showing us, what is a project that the Funder Alliance with our partners worked on to kind of get more information and try to have an increased conversation. I'm going to pivot a little bit now to talk a little bit around the pathways piece in which as well. So if we think about, we have the data, we have the information, how are we trying to affect systems in the Chicagoland area? So the Funder Alliance also hosts to the Progressive Pathways Fund. The Progressive Pathways Fund is a sub-fund of the Funder Alliance. You'll see the management committee members, and which takes the workforce development funders that are part of the Funder Alliance and also adds education funders or funders who traditionally fund in education as well. And the Progressive Pathway Fund, separate than a Progressive Pathway, and a Progressive Pathway we define as it's a career pathway that allows individuals to alternate between and combine periods of education and training and employment. So on-ramps and off-ramps of school and work. So we talk about the college mobility myth that Michael was talking about as well. Progressive pathways do incorporate college, but we're trying to figure out, can we create an ecosystem in the Chicagoland area where we can understand what progressive pathways actually are? And then can we increase knowledge about what these programs are? And then can we also establish quality guidance around them? So objectives guiding the work around collecting data. So that's the piece around, can we actually define what a progressive pathway program is? So there's 8 criteria, and Ed Systems Center played an integral role in creating kind of what the actual criteria are of what we're using. So it's things like, does it have a sector focus? Are there wraparound services involved with it? And then we need to have, it's one thing to have that information and have that data, and then be able to, but we need to be able to look at it in a consistent, unified way. So that's kind of objective 2. And there's something called Careerpathways.net, which is a online tool to go and actually look at what are progressive pathways in the Chicagoland region. So we have a fellow working on that right now at the Funder Alliance, and maintaining that is a really big task, because the thought here is, if you're looking at college, you can look at Barron's Book of Colleges and you can see these are the colleges that are, I want to be an engineer, I want to work in some other thing. You can kind of see the list of programs, or the list of universities, colleges, schools that have programs, but that doesn't exist for workforce development programs, career pathway programs, progressive pathway programs. The funding mechanism in which they're funded is through different pots of money that kind of lead to different ways of tracking outcomes, that lead to different ways of even reporting their information or people's eligibility around that. So as a result, it becomes really challenging to be able to see what they are. So I encourage you to take a look at careerpathways.net as a place where we're starting to collect that information. And then so then kind of moving on from that, it's one thing we feel to actually have the information, have a place to look at it and look through it, but that we need to also have quality guidance around that as well. And thinking about the way we're guiding young adults into a pathway program or into a career that makes the most sense for them, and that actually takes their agency and has them be active in creating what the future they want, as opposed to any sort of prescription on where they should or should not be. So there's been the creation of a curriculum called the Chicago College and Career Access Credential. CCAC is the term that it's being used, and that's being deployed currently at Chicago Public Schools for all their school counselors to go through, but also the Chicago Jobs Council and their Frontline Focused Training Institute is also training youth guides on that as well in this CCAC curriculum as well. And they actually just had their first graduation for the cohort that started pre-COVID pandemic, and they just wrapped up. So it was like half in person and then half over Zoom. So, and these are guides of organizations that are guides within organizations that are guiding young people into career pathways as well. And also trying to say that, college for all might not be where everyone wants to be, but that should not be seen as like plan B. That should not be seen as, less than college for all. So that's a piece of that's a piece of the guidance. And then also, I know Michael talked about navigation, and I just want to say that as we're kind of thinking about into this year where we're moving with what the fund, ProPath Fund, wants to focus on, there's a number of different efforts as well around navigating this workforce development system, which can be a little bit complicated and complex, and kind of having a more of a unified front door model that says if somebody comes in, we can figure out on the back end all the supports that somebody might have, as opposed to putting the onus on a participant or on a young person or anybody for that matter to figure out the ways in which the funding opportunities might work for them. And one other thing I would just say, the COVID impact, the status of programs, plans for young adults may have changed, and mindsets might be shifting as well. Is there enough capacity? Is there enough enrollment? We're still kind of grappling with that as well. And maybe the final thing I'll say on this second third of the presentation is just that the systems that we're trying to build here with the Careerpathways.net and the guidance and collecting the data has a focus on young adults. But these are systems, these are pieces that work for really anybody as well too. So careerpathways.net can be filterable and can look at if you're a returning citizen, if you are looking for a career change in your life. So that's part of the piece of the systemic work, is that it has a focus absolutely on young adults right now, but it can absolutely be used and implemented by adults or anybody really along the spectrum as well. So for the final third of the presentation, then we talked about what the data is showing us, and then we're talking about, what is a systemic piece we're trying to do with this Progressive Pathways Fund, and then we're going to talk a little bit about how do we activate employers for change. And I'm trying to create a through line between all this, and happy to kind of talk more about how all this kind of fits in together. But this activating employers for change is something we're using with the sector partnership model. So, which is kind of, you may have heard me mention earlier, which is like the bread and butter thing of workforce development right now. So sector partnerships, for those who don't know, they're partnerships of companies, oftentimes in the same industry, in the specific region, and then you bring together stakeholders from education, workforce development, economic development, community organizations to focus on key priority areas by that industry. So it's kind of thinking about it, if you think about it from like an organizing perspective, it's trying to find the mutual self-interest of companies in a certain sector, but then also with what kind of the priorities of the facilitator and the region might ultimately need. So the Funder Alliance has increasing racial equity in its mission statement. That is the lens that we bring to this work as well. So we often say we want these to be employer-led, we want them to be employer-driven, but if the employers were to say, we want to eliminate half our workforce, that's not something we would support. So what we're trying to do is find, when we hear employers say, we can't find enough good workers, or we can't do X, Y, and Z, that activates us to think, okay, well, what are the systemic problems that are existing in that way? And how can we figure out a way to increase equity through a way that benefits everybody? So it's trying to think of these pre-competitive challenges that happen, and then thinking about by creating solutions that benefit everybody. So some examples in Chicagoland are the Chicagoland Healthcare Workforce Collaborative, which focuses predominantly on hospital systems in the Chicagoland area. The Financial Services Pipeline, which focuses on financial services companies, also in the Chicagoland areas. The Calumet Manufacturing Industry Sector Partnership, CMISP, and that focuses on what you might think it is, manufacturing in the Calumet area. There's an emerging new, and then there are two new emerging ones in early childhood education and also in public health. So these are some examples in Chicagoland. And the last thing I want to talk about is an example of the Chicagoland Healthcare Workforce Collaborative in how they've actually started to change internal processes as well, and investing in their own frontline workforce as a way to try and promote greater equity. So you can read the mission, you can read the goals, but the example I'm going to highlight is this thing called the Medical Assistant Pathway Program. So I'd say the first 18 months of the collaborative was really, maybe the first year of the collaborative was a lot of trust building. It was a lot of bringing together, recruiting hospital systems to get into the same room and kind of say, why would I be sitting with my competitor? And I use that term loosely because they're healthcare, but there is an element of competing for talent. And then to kind of identify. So we would bring, HR, talent management, into the room and say, what keeps you up at night? What is a challenge that you are collectively facing? And one of them came up with, one thing that came up was, retention and career pathways within our institution. So we've all seen the charts that kind of show in different places in healthcare, this is a way that you can kind of go through your career. It's not just a doctor or a nurse. You can get in the healthcare system and work your way through. To actually talk with a lot of the hospital systems, you learn that yeah, that kind of makes sense, but every hospital system is a little bit different. Every hospital system is really busy, and they don't really have internal career pathway programs established or set up internally. And there's a lot of just silos that end up emerging. So what we ended up funding and supporting and getting is 4 hospital systems to come together and say, we're going to start this medical assistant pathway program, and we're going to take predominantly entry-level frontline workers who are in non-clinical positions. So this, if you think like patient transport, environmental service, food service workers who've been working at our hospitals for over a year for right now. They come to work, they are in a job though that there is not really even the potential for a career trajectory to happen. We train them to be entry-level clinical positions, so medical assistants, which is a high demand position for these 4 hospital systems. And candidly, like the pay, not that much different, but the difference is that once they were in the clinical side, we also worked with the hospital systems to internally change and establish their internal processes to also identify what are some pathway programs or what is a potential pathway internally towards greater wages and towards greater pieces. So we worked with Chicago Cook Workforce Partnership, which distributes the federal dollars around job training. We work with City Colleges of Chicago, Malcolm X, and then the hospital systems themselves to co-design a cohort across 4 hospital systems and to provide a way to train around 20 non-clinical frontline entry-level workers and have them become, on the clinical side, medical assistants as well. So it was all completely paid for by braiding funding together. And then the first cohort actually just graduated recently as well, which was great. And now future cohorts are happening. So it's a program, and we wanted to invest in that program. However, there's a lot of systemic changes that have happened as well, because a lot of the workers that were on the entry-level non-clinical side were predominantly Black and brown workers who were going to be in a place where they were not going to necessarily have a career plan trajectory within the hospital system. And now that has happened, but we have hospital systems that have changed their policies as well. So a lot of them had tuition remission programs, but they didn't necessarily, it would only be for a 4-year program. So to get a medical assistant certification or accreditation from Malcolm X, some of these hospital systems did not allow for that to be reimbursed. So now they changed their systems, they were able to do that. And also just, sorry, I'm mindful of time. Yeah, so that's, I can talk more about that in a little bit, but yeah, so that's essentially what happened with it. It was using a program in service of systemic change in both getting hospital systems to look at their talent in a different way, to invest in their talent, to change internal systems, to actually start doing that, and then also identify career pathways internally. But that took a lot of work, and that's just one thing. So I have this slide here. Is it enough? I don't know. So I'm going to wrap up there, and we can maybe get into the conversation some more. Feel free to reach out to me too. I know I see the chat. There's some things in there. I'm looking forward to talking some more. But thanks for having me here this morning with you all.
Thank you, Adrian. There is a hopefully quick question of clarification in the chat about what the program trains the medical assistants to be, or what kinds of roles they may get trained to be, and then we'll dive into the fireside chat.
Yeah, so it's at Malcolm X, they actually have a medical assistant program that trains them to be a medical assistant. So I'm not exactly sure what's all in the curriculum, but it was designed with input from hospital systems as well. And then, that was also part of the challenge, was that, a medical assistant at Rush, for example, might do different things than a medical assistant at Northwestern. So finding a program that actually meets the demands. And I guess that's another kind of piece where these sector partnerships work, because you start to see that a training program and a training provider trains maybe towards one specification, but that's not what everybody actually wants or needs. So kind of building those reps of communication between training providers and education providers with industry is also really important. So
awesome, thank you so much. And I'll ask Michael to rejoin the room here. Thank you both so much for your presentations. It's the clear message I got from both of you is that there's no one single narrative that tells us how people can succeed in our country, in our communities, in jobs, et cetera, right? That going to college is not the only solution, and going into the trades is not necessarily the only solution either, right? That there are other touch points in the pipeline and other issues that complicate things, certainly. And so I've got a few questions. If folks have other questions, please feel free to use the Q&A function and I'll monitor that. But I have a few questions just to get us started here. The first one is about social capital. Both of you talk about how social capital shapes navigation of our education and workforce and employment systems. And so what are some ways that we can shape those systems to better support agency for individuals and cultivate that social capital that can lead to better outcomes for marginalized groups? And I'll let either of you go ahead and get started with that.
We're both too polite. I'm happy to start. So I think just very simply, transparency, I think, is the first thing, right? So like when we talk about the college mobility narrative, I'm there's a part of this that I hope everybody understands is hyperbolic, right? Like I'm trying to get us to think about it. Of course, college matters, right? But I'm trying to suggest that like there are some things that have been left out of this story, right? One of them is the importance of social capital. If you complete a credential and no one who can pick up the phone for you, and make a call to make an employment opportunity available to you, that is a huge challenge. And we're finding that upper income students have that in some ways automatically. And, they have parents who are professionals and their aunts and uncles. And, there are so many more entry points into kind of employment. So the first thing I think is transparency. Low-income people and people of color need to understand you need more than college. You need kind of college, you need relationships, you need training, right? Like it's not just college, don't get me wrong, but like I think broadly there is a set of skills, competencies, credentials, relationships, and supports that people need to make successful transitions to the labor market. When we say, go to college, right? And then you're going to graduate and everything's going to be great. We're just leaving too much out of that story, right? So what I think I was doing and what I heard Adrian doing is trying to put some more, information in there to really kind of make visible the combination of things that will create mobility. But I think that social capital is one of the biggest ones, I think, that have been left out. And it's challenging in that many, because of structural racism, let's be clear, we have warehoused, Americans, right? Like in different places, right? And in some ways, those homogeneous communities, some of them don't have access, right? Like to employers by design, right? Like, so like, I think that when people come into our workforce agencies and our higher education institutions, we have to be transparent about that. Like, right, like how do we connect them to the kinds of social capital, right, that can help them with employment? This is not to suggest that they don't have social capital. Of course they do, right? But they have a different kind of capital, right? And there are kind of people who, again, like I just said, are just more connected to employers, and we want to try to provide some support around that.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what Michael's saying. I'll just add that I think, I know we're going to talk a little about this some more, but I think that's one of the, gets at really just that piece that in traditional workforce development, we can't just train our way out of these economic disparities. And I mean, I think the data is showing that, even when we do get people educated to the same level, that the racial gaps are still there. And they're so, I think like, it's a hard thing to work on, but I think part of like the social capital piece is, I think part of these sector partnerships, what they're really trying to do is within them is you build enough trust within industry or within an employer group to then say, these are some other avenues of sourcing your talent that you might not look at normally. So in the case of some of these hospitals, it was in their hospital already. You know, they're looking for medical assistants and they're looking from other places, but they have individuals already working there as well. And then a lot of these are located in areas with tremendous amounts of local unemployment as well that haven't looked at the surrounding areas as a place for talent. So they're also starting to examine what are some of their internal barriers as well. So you know, we see the disproportionate amount of incarceration and policing on Black and brown communities, which then creates a barrier to employment in a hospital and health system. Well, these hospitals can now organize themselves and become advocates for changing the way those systems happen as well. So, I mean, that's not really necessarily like increasing social capital as much as it's like trying to shift existing behavior or just kind of that that current feel are happening right now. I got distracted by the chat.
That's okay. I think Adrian, your comments kind of pivoted us towards the second bucket question that I had, which is around the skills narrative, right? So we often hear in education, workforce, and employment circles about a skills gap or a skills agenda. There are whole organizations built around that, and you started to prod on this a little bit, Adrian, but I would welcome more comments from either or both of you about how that narrative either helps or harms our ability to actually rectify these historical inequities in access and outcomes.
Yeah, I'll just jump in and just say that, yeah, like this notion of the skills gap, I don't know if I really, I mean, yeah, people need skills, but like I don't know if I totally buy it. And I think the reason is, if you look at hiring practices for certain corporations and certain companies, they've established a bachelor's degree as a requirement for no other reason. It's just a way to filter people in and out. And when people start that job anyway, sometimes they get like 6 months of training. And I'm thinking about like within financial institutions. So the idea, so there's a skills gap right there. And if somebody had been trained to do that job perfectly, but did not have a bachelor degree from a certain university, they would not have an entry point into the door in the first place. So I think, so I'm not trying to like be too much of like a hater on like skills gaps in general, because like, yeah, like we need skills, we need to get people trained, but similarly, like we need to think about these institutions and structures that have been created as a way to create barriers as opposed to create places of entry. So I'm not trying to like say we don't need to think about skills or we don't need to think about that at all, but I think that that's one component and one piece.
I couldn't agree more. And I think that, like using college, right, like as a discrete strategy for upward mobility, we do the same thing around skills, right? So like, if you think about over the last couple decades, the college completion agenda has been a big deal. College for all, right? And so now we're in this, as you said, Emily, it's like skills, like Adrian was saying, like we want to skill our way out of, skill our way to equity, right? And it doesn't add up, right? So when you think about skills, right, like, again, it goes back to like, it's not just skills, right? Like there are competencies, there are different credentials, like you need different relationships, right? There are different kinds of skills. We know from, burning glasses work, there are technical skills, digital skills, people skills, business process skills, right? So which skills, right? So I think that we really need to interrogate when we have these kind of single and discrete kind of solutions, particularly around equity, right? Like equity is complex and adaptive, right? Economic mobility is complex. There are multiple elements. It's adaptive, right? It's not kind of this technical on-off thing. So skills is a part of, the equation, but certainly they're not the only thing. And I worry a little bit about that skills are being put forward as the solution for low-income people and people of color. And if you think about the first order effects of that, right? Like let's say skills get people to jobs, right? Like, so last February and March, yes, get people skills, get them into jobs, right? Like unemployment spiked with COVID, I get that, right? But like if we start thinking about second and third order effects, if we have low-income people and people of color, the ceiling is skilled, that means they can't be judges. They can't participate, kind of in our legal system, like at the level, right, like that we would want them to. They cannot be met, right? Like just think about that, right? So certainly skills is no singular solution, and certainly skills cannot be the ceiling for low-income people and people of color.
Thank you both. So I have one more question, and then I will try and combine some of the questions that are in the chat and the Q&A. I might be touching a third rail here, and I think you both know where I'm going with this. Employers are obviously a huge part of the system, and often they are framed as customers of our education and workforce training systems. And so given that amount of power that they have over employment realities, including for all groups, including historically marginalized groups, how can other actors and policymakers in the system apply pressure to these employers to change their behavior? And also, if you've seen any examples where employers have seem to be truly leading for equity, would welcome those examples as well.
I think it's a great, I'll jump in really quick. I think it's a great question. I have a different perspective. I think we need to be putting pressure on all of our systems. I see racial stratification, class stratification in our post-secondary system. I see it in our workforce development system. It's documented, right? Like, it's documented. When you look at the demographics of our colleges and universities, right? Like, it's pretty clear, right? When you look at our workforce development system, it's pretty clear. The workforce development system, was not created, like a post-secondary system was not created, it was not designed to advance low-income people and people of color. I would say that on the post-secondary side, before we, or maybe simultaneous as we interrogate, employers in their role, let's clean house, right? Like, let's make sure that we are divesting ourselves of, kind of racial structures, right? And that we have equity. And then with regard to employers, we absolutely, I think, want to use our capital, whether it's the social capital of higher education institutions, to pressure employers to treat graduates fairly, by gender, by race, right? Like, how do we hold employers accountable for, for equity? And I think that that it's a both and. I don't think that it's just the employers that have to do it. When I look at the demographics of, to be really honest, even the nonprofit sector, when you look at the nonprofit sector in leadership, actually 90 some odd % of kind of like foundation directors, right, like, are white. I don't know if it's 90%, but it's pretty close. When you think about the executive directors of nonprofit organizations, it's pretty high. So, like, before we call out employers, right, I think we need to make sure that we are also calling out kind of the changes that our education and workforce development and nonprofit sector need to also be doing.
Yes, that's a good question. I think that a lot of work needs to be done with employers specifically. I think the sector partnership model is one way to do it, that we talked about. I think in healthcare, we've had some success. I know that's a different type of industry than others as well. I mean, I think part of the challenge is that some of these entry-level occupations have changed so much. There's like so many systemic things that happen. So, like, when we think about healthcare, for example, the hiring manager gets talent from a third-party individual who then refers people in there. So if you're trying to do like work with employers on a hospital level, they might have an initiative that says we want to hire locally, or we want to hire X, Y, and Z. But the sourcing of talent into there is different. And then if you think about like some of our workers that operate on the margins of the formal and into the informal economy as well, where temp agencies reign over certain areas of logistics and warehousing jobs as well, that traditionally could have been decent paying, provide a way to then kind of alternate on a progressive pathway. Now, these solutions towards employment for some of these, it's just to cycle through and just churn through as many workers as they can. And the employers kind of move the liability down the chain a little bit, because they're just sourcing from a tech company. So yeah, it's just like, I say that like there's just a lot of systemic change that needs to happen, both in internal hiring practices by employers, to the way work is sourced and created. So I think that's part of when in the report we're talking about trying to center workers and center people's experiences, and what is it like to try and navigate this world and this system. And then also, because once people are employed, what is the culture of an environment that they're working in? You know, retention issues might not just be because they didn't get a good retention training, you know, module with them. It might just be because the workplace is inherently racist and or sexist, or in a way that, you know, creates an environment that is not, you know, that is not great for people to work in. So I think integrating into some of the work as well of workforce development of worker rights is really important, because it allows people to understand, you know, let me learn how to read my paycheck to make sure that I'm not a victim of wage theft. And it's not always because of nefarious reasons, or I'm actually classified correctly as an employee versus a contractor. These are things that we're, you know, I don't mean to be like, I don't know. There's just so much to it that yeah, and players play a big role.
I appreciate both of your responses there. You know, the message is obviously it's an all and certainly the whole system has racism pervasive throughout, and that there's no one challenge and there's no one solution, certainly. So one more question before we wrap up, and this is going to be me kind of trying to summarize the number of questions that have come in through the chat and the Q&A, which is essentially, what can folks in the system do to help build that social capital that you guys have talked a lot about, given that it plays such a vital role? So what can program providers do to build that social capital? And both of you kind of started touching on this a little bit, but maybe we'll just close out with a few comments there about how folks either in the education or workforce system can help build that social capital that's so essential for folks being able to access and advance in our workforce.
I can be really brief. So again, my colleague Nancy Hoffman and I co-edited a book, and it's called Teaching Students About the World of Work. One thing we can do is actually teach it, right? That teach the importance of social capital, right? Teach the importance of making connections while you're in college that actually can help you make successful transitions, or, you know, or being explicit, like at the workforce, you know, agency level, you know, around like, you know, even mapping. I've heard people doing mapping, like who do you know, and really stressing that it actually is really important for you to actually get out of your network. People in the same networks have the same information, right? Helping people to kind of, you know, you don't have to have strong ties, right? The research says you can actually leverage even weak ties. The Granovetter research, you know, around kind of the strength of weak ties, right? So I think that one, it's really transparency, and post-secondary institutions and workforce development agencies, we can actually be explicit. This is critical. Most jobs are not, you know, many jobs are not posted. They're internal hires, right? Like you really have to have, you have to be in the know, right? Like many of our jobs, if we were honest about it, we had a referral, we knew someone, you know, someone called us. So I think we need to acknowledge that reality.
Yeah, I'd agree with all of that for sure. And I would add, I think, you know, increasing connections between employers and this large workforce development system that we talk about just generally. So everything from all the training providers to the city colleges to all sorts of education and training. And I say that as a way to kind of like jumpstart or boost elements of social capital in a way that sometimes employers don't understand or even know about training programs that are in the workforce development system, because their hiring comes from all the ways that we're just detailing. So I think the more we can elevate and publicize and bring in relationships between the two, that's one way that we can start to do it. And it ultimately also then relies on us supporting this what you know, the fundamentally believe is underfunded system that is to get people actually opportunities there as well. So I think, you know, just to add on to that, to what Michael was saying, that I think just, you know, I think about like, yes, we need to increase networks, increase those pieces, but there's like this systemic piece that we want to keep working on, or we need to keep working on, so that we can strive to not be so reliant on just the insider information.
Thank you both so much for your time and your thoughts here. You know, often people say, when you know better, you do better, right? So this is a valiant effort at helping us all know better, and also with some really targeted suggestions about how we can do better. So I just so deeply appreciate your time and your expertise, and you sharing that and kind of getting in the muck with all of us and mucking through these really challenging issues and systemic issues that are no one entity or portion of the system's responsibility. And also it is all of our responsibility all at the same time to grapple with these challenges. Thank you again to Adrian and Michael. Just so deeply appreciate your time and you sharing your expertise. All of these sessions will be recorded and shared on our conference website. So check those out there or check out any sessions you've missed. And thanks everyone, and hope you all have a wonderful day. Take care.